Learning community is a series of meetings that are really engaged and designed to really go through chapter by chapter the information and the wealth of skills and assessments and others information that is shared in the Buried in Treasures reference. As it relates to the meeting schedule, they are going to be held, and I have to make sure this is corrected, a Tuesday each month from 10 a.m. So have to correct that. That's a 10 a.m. start, and it goes from 10 a.m. to 11:30. The link that you currently are using is going to be the same link that you're going to use ongoingly. So you don't need to register each time. It's an ongoing registration. So basic housekeeping, this is a meeting format, so you'll have the opportunity to share your information in the chat and to utilize the Zoom elements to be able to do so. You have the option of, if you're struggling with any challenges with regards to having a video option, you certainly are free to use a call-in information. And the call-in information is listed there, and I will also ask Crystal to share that call-in information with you in the chat, so you'll have that option available to you. Certainly your video can be on and off, and you're free to share that information as you find prudent as we go along. So, hearty welcome to you, and I want to get to know you in terms of where you work in Washington, what specific job-related elements you engage in, so that we have a better sense as to who you are and what's your reason for joining the Buried in Treasure learning community. So I'm going to launch a poll and ask that you share that information with us. If you can access the poll and provide us with some feedback, would be helpful.
Are we to speak?
Are you able to access the poll? Please let me know if you're able to see the poll show up.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't. Can you do it again?
Are you able to see the poll? There is a link that should come up. They should be able to actually access the poll.
Can you resend it? Can you resend the poll? I do apologize.
That's quite all right. I'm going to try that again.
Earl, I can see the poll, so I'm not sure if it's just certain folks.
Yeah. If it's been long, so most folks can see it. Zaynova, I'm not certain what your first name is. The person that's currently saying that you're not able to. Yeah. Let me double check. I'm not certain why you're not able to access the poll. But what I'm going to do for your benefit is I'm going to ask those questions, and you
can. Is it BIT introduction poll?
Yes, that's it.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic.
What region of Washington? And this is going to sound funny, but I have been here in Washington State for the past 14 and a half, 15 almost years. And I do apologize, but
you're not certain where you are in Washington. You're not alone. That's quite all right. This is it's all in the learning process. So it's a great time to know where you are in Washington, right?
What region am I in?
Where are you? Where do you work, or what location are you in?
Tyler Family Housing with TRM, Tacoma Rescue Mission.
They get all that too. Then we have birthdays. Yep. We don't know my big dog.
Turn off
your what region am I in?
South.
Anybody know?
Yeah, you're in South Puget Sound.
Thank you. Okay, got it.
So what I'm going to also ask folks to do, and if you care to do so, is to be reminded that if you're not currently speaking, to make sure you're on mute, so we can minimize the background noise and we can make the most of our opportunity. Well, thank you for clearing that up. I've learned something. I'm learning about Washington every time because we're located in New Jersey. So Washington is a place that we're getting to know better. So we're all in a learning phase here. So someone is asking, what region is Seattle? You know what? I am fine with you just saying Seattle, Washington. It gives me a sense of where you are. But that's great. So I'm going to quickly, someone says North Puget Sound. It just sounds great. Washington has these phenomenal regional names. It just sounds great to me. So let's take a look. I'm going to wrap up the poll now, and we're going to take a look at the responses so we get a sense as to where people are. And certainly, if you're uncertain, just share in the chat where you are, where your program is, and that'll be fine. So in terms of what region do you work in, we have the majority of folks in North Puget Sound, and I'm hoping everyone has a sense as to where that is. And we have also great representation from the 4 folks in the Northwest.
Hoarding.
Fantastic. So what type of agency do you work for? More than 3/4 of you say housing. So we have a predominantly housing slant here. There's some folks in mental health and a great deal of folks who are in other programs. So that's a great cross-section and diverse representation. What is your primary role in your program? And the largest contingent of folks says direct service staff. So that's great to know you actually on the ground in the trenches doing the major work. So we're glad to have that. We have good representation as well for supervisors and managers. So that's great. What motivated you to join Buried in Treasures Learning Community? A great deal of folks that I work with consumers whose hoarding problems cause problems. That's understandable. That's to be expected. We have quite a few folks as well who want to help family members or friends who struggle with hoarding. So that's great to know. And what do you hope to improve by joining this learning community? I think the vast majority of folks says knowledge of hoarding disorder. So it's really getting a good understanding of what hoarding is. What does it look like? What does it present like? So folks also want to know skills to assess and to address hoarding. The same goes for resources to help people, to support people with hoarding. So great, thank you very much for sharing that information. It certainly lends itself to a great understanding as to what this particular learning community can do for you and what you hope to gain from it. So definitely glad to have that. So I'm hoping that my initial introduction was sufficient, but I want to make sure that folks are fully aware as to the fact that this particular learning community and the facilitation of this learning community is certainly being coordinated through DBHR and is contracted through Rutgers University School for Health Profession. It's my employer, and I certainly hope to learn a lot about agencies and providers here in Washington and how you grapple with the major challenge of hoarding disorder and cluttering challenges and its impact on your consumers' functioning and their ability to integrate smoothly into the community. So we'll be focused on really addressing those concerns. Any questions there? Are we all on the same page? Want to make sure before we get into the meat of things that we all have a sense as to why we're here, what we're expected to gain out of this, and what it should look like.
Yes.
Fantastic. So the Buried in Treasure learning community really is focused on the book Buried in Treasure. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but it was really written for people who are suffering from hoarding concerns, people whose loved ones have hoarding challenges, and for professionals who work with people who hoard. So it's one of a very unique collection of books or references that really addresses hoarding through the lens and through the purpose of both from the professionals and folks who are also supporting people with hoarding, as well as people who may have families or themselves being challenged by the whole issues related to hoarding. So it's important that it's written with that perspective in mind, written with that awareness in mind. And bear with me one moment. And let me make sure that my recording is on. Very well. And I'm going to ask a question. Fantastic. Very good. So as I mentioned, this particular book really addresses hoarding through those lens, the diverse lens. It really gives information that is both effective and has great utility for both the professional, the person who may be in themselves dealing with hoarding, as well as people who support and help each other or help loved ones in the same realm. So what is it designed to do? It's a self-help guide that really provides insight towards what behavioral change needs to occur and how to make those behavioral change, manifest those behavioral change in order to address hoarding. So it's really designed to really address hoarding from the perspective of all those different categories of people. We have also the desire and intent to provide supports beyond simply the Buried in Treasure book. There's also supports beyond hoarding. So there's information related to CBT for hoarding behaviors that is really encapsulated in the OCD Foundation and the Association for Behavior and Cognitive Therapies. We also will look at some professional organizers who really address hoarding, as well as references and workbook through treatment for hoarding disorders and a therapist guide and workbooks. There's lots of references that will be used concomitantly to address the concern within this particular learning community. But our primary focus is going to be using the Buried in Treasures text. So the learning community, in a sense, as to what's its purpose and use. It's designed to really provide resources for consumers and resources for those who are serving consumers and resources that you can actually use in a group setting. So there's a number of Buried in Treasures work groups. What is important to note is this is not a particular work group for Buried in Treasures. This is a learning community for people who support folks with hoarding, who provide services to people who are experiencing hoarding, and for folks who may have hoarding issues themselves or loved ones who are hoarding. So what we will do is really review the content, look at the best practices, and really get a good sense of what the resources are for our attempts to really address hoarding with the folks that we work with, the folks that we love, or even for ourselves. So it's important to note. What is expected is that we expect you to really engage actively in the discourse around this subject matter, so we're able to share information, share knowledge, skills, and resources. We expect everyone to be seen and viewed as an expert in this particular element, because even if you're providing services to someone with hoarding, you have that expertise in what your particular challenge is, as well as if that person is themselves dealing with hoarding. We want to have your expertise in that element. So we want to respect everyone from that perspective as they're an expert on themselves and their own situation. So treat folks with respect. We want people to make sure that they're doing the work, which is completing the learning applications. At the end of every meeting, there's a learning application where you're expected to take a particular skill, tool, or assessment and utilize it in the field and provide some feedback, so we're all able to learn from each person's experience as to how they actually operationalize those skills and what was the feedback and what was the learning opportunity. So it's really a full-fledged opportunity to not only digest the information and content from the text, but also to really practice some of those elements and to get feedback and to see where things are progressively as we move towards supporting people with hoarding disorders. Any questions there? Anything that is surprising to you? Anything you didn't thought it was? Are you now fully aware as to what we were intending to do in this process? We want to make sure that we have that same understanding. Very good. I'm going to assume that silence or no response means that everyone is on the same page and fully understand as to what we're engaged in doing.
Sure. Sure.
Bravo. So it's important for us to get a sense as to when we talk about hoarding behaviors and clutter, what are we really talking about? What is it that we're trying to engage? What does it mean? What does it look like? So when we talk about hoarding or excessive clutter, we talk about the difficulty folks have with discarding possessions. Now, it's important to note that that's one element of hoarding problems. We also want to take a conscientious look at folks that save items to the extent that it's used to avoid distress. So it's a continuous process of collecting stuff with the hope that it really keeps distress at bay. We have that sense of constant renewal, and therefore we don't have to look at the distressing concerns that we have. We want to look at cluttered spaces that hinder the use of this that particular space as it's designed. You know, whether it's in our own situation or clients that we're providing services to, when there is the extent of clutter within their living space or the space that they occupy, that it really hinders use as it's designed. A classic example, if you have a kitchen that is so cluttered with stuff that the person is unable to cook safely or to operate in that kitchen in a safe manner, you know, whether it's with fall risk being increased or whether or not there's concerns about fire because there's flammable items on places that actually have a burner or stove. Those are some of the concerns we'll be looking at in terms of really getting a sense of the elements of what really clutter looks like and the distress and impairment that results from the existence of these circumstances. Because ultimately, when we talk about a disorder or a significant problem related to a behavior, we're talking about the degree of distress and functional impairment it causes. So those are some of the primary elements, the foremost elements of hoarding and cluttering behaviors. So we want to make sure that we're aware as to what we should be looking for, how nuanced it is, and what it presents. So we're talking about excessive possessions to the extent that it becomes very difficult to discard, really saving and collecting items to the extent that we are using it to avoid distress, and the essence of our space being so cluttered and so cumbersome that we can't use it in the way it's designed. And all these elements, or some of these elements, are really creating significant distress and impairment in functioning for the person who is experiencing these concerns. As we know, hoarding disorder has certainly been assigned a specific diagnostic criteria. It has very specific elements that is articulated very clearly in the DSM-5. And this took quite some work to get here, but we're certainly happy that we finally are able to put a name put a description, a definition, and really have a great sense as to how this particular distressing and impairing condition is defined in a way that makes it clear, makes it discernible, and really able to really look at it as a functional issue and as a challenge of the person's, not the person's lack of, but more so a clinical disorder and a clinical challenge that requires engagement and intervention, and not simply judgment of that person. And that's important to note, because for a long time, there have a lot of people who were really challenged by hoarding concerns, who were merely seen as derelict, lazy, problematic, and not really seeing it from the clinical standpoint. And that's important for us to shift that paradigm to really get a better understanding and have a greater sensitivity and empathy and compassion and an ability to really garner the skills required to really support that person effectively. So in terms of the DSM-5, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5, in terms of how hoarding disorder is defined, first of all, it's important to note that it's really classified in the obsessive compulsive and related disorder category. And what it really looks like in terms of its presentation. So we're talking about persistent difficulty discarding or parting with possessions, regardless of their actual value. And that's important to note. And Harriet mentioned most individuals with hoarding disorder are in denial. There is some element of truth to that, and there's some element of, and we'll talk some more about what that looks like, because some of it is denial, some of it is simply not being aware of what it is. So there's that element of that, but thank you for sharing. So it's important to note we're talking about challenges and difficulty discarding or parting with possessions regardless of their value. And as you see, a lot of the descriptive element of it is really clearly defined in a way that really helps remove those misconceptions. So this difficulty is due to a perceived need to save the items and the distress associated with discarding them. So it's really a challenge that person have with holding on to those items, and even the thought of getting rid of them leads to a tremendous amount of distress. What is important to note is when we're talking about hoarding as a disorder, we're talking about it's causing clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning, including maintaining a safe environment. So it's not merely having an abundance of collection that is cluttering the space. It's those significantly impairing elements of it. The social impact it has, the occupational impact. So when we're talking about someone, house is so cluttered that they're unwilling or unable to have social engagement in that space. Or merely because of that concept of fear or anxiety around having that staff, people are not able to engage in their general occupation, may not be able to go to work because of the concerns or the distressing element of it. Or whether it becomes a significant safety concern for that person because they're unable to maneuver, or there's concerns about fire hazard. They may face eviction because the space is so cluttered and unhygienic and unsafe. And it's important to note that hoarding as a disorder has to be a situation where it's not better explained by other symptoms of other mental disorders. So we have to ensure that we're ruling out other disorders. So it has to have that authenticity, that sense of being able to be discerned specifically from other conditions. So I'm hoping that with that understanding from a clinical standpoint, you're able to look at hoarding as basically a clinical condition that really creates a tremendous amount of distress. And in supported housing and supported employment, you could imagine how far-reaching those impairments and functional challenges and distress can. It certainly can impact every dimension of someone's life in essence. So I want to take this opportunity to kind of share with you a perspective about hoarding, kind of a definition from Carolyn Rodriguez. I want to make sure my video is. Okay. I think what's going on with the video? Bear with me. So let me do this for a moment. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and grab this video. I want to make sure that we have this video. It's a great way of describing hoarding.
Earl, I put the link in the chat if you need it.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay. I think it's intended to challenge me today, so I'm going to purposely try to overcome that challenge, right? So let me know if you can hear it.
Difficulty parting with possessions, and parting with those possessions causes distress, impairment in individuals' lives. And this distress manifests in clutter that impairs living spaces. So individuals aren't, for example, able to cook in their kitchen or sleep on their beds. And the symptoms of difficulty parting with possessions and clutter aren't otherwise characterized by a comorbid medical problem. So for example, somebody who has broken their arm and can't physically remove objects from their home, that would not be characterized as hoarding disorder. And similarly, not accounted for by another psychiatric condition. So for example, individuals with obsessive compulsive disorder may have intrusive thoughts about touching items and fears about contamination. So they may also not be able to remove items from their home, but that wouldn't be characterized as hoarding disorder. Now, hoarding disorder has a prevalence of 2 to 6% in the population, and it's quite impairing for individuals. They have difficulty with, can have impairments in social relationships and work functioning, And that's where it really crosses the line between having an interest and passion for objects and crossing the line into a hoarding disorder. Hoarding disorder.
So that's generally, a really good concrete overview of hoarding disorder. I think she did a great job of really discerning clearly, that differentiation between someone just passionate about collecting stuff and that impairing element of it and how it may impact that person's life, and the fact that it should be a situation where it's not explained by another circumstance or limitation. So that's important to note when we're looking at hoarding from that perspective. So is that the way you see it? Is that the way you are able to, you see it play out in whatever circumstance you're in, whether it's supporting someone with that condition or a loved one, or even in your own situation? Do you see it play out that way? And so he says, I have residents coming in, I will have to leave them in. Oh, that's absolutely fine, Sonova. But I think she did a great job, like I said, of really discerning hoarding as a condition that is both distressing and impairing, and it certainly is not explained by another circumstance.
Hoarding disorder is.
So in terms of we want to take a look at the background in terms of behavioral and mental health. How does hoarding relate to those conditions? In many regards, and Pam shared online hoarding disorder conference Saturday, Sunday, March 4th to 5th. IOC absolutely is great. So great to see the folks sharing that information. It's a great the IOCDF really has great information on hoarding as a disorder, and from that perspective, so it's great to share that information. What we find is that we have a number of folks, particularly in our supported housing and supported employment concept, who may actually present with significant concerns around clutter and collection and hoarding stuff, but maybe subclinical. They may not meet the clinical definition of hoarding, but even some of the behavior is subclinical in nature, right? It may be creating a situation where the more collection of stuff people have, it's creating more of a risk concern, or they may be at risk of contravening their lease, their housing lease, because of the amount of stuff they're collecting. So it's important to understand that even though 2 to 6% of the population have a clinical diagnosable hoarding disorder, there may be lots of folks who may be subclinical, and some of those behavior may be inherently challenging and in some ways could be stressful for folks or somewhat distressing. What's important to note as well is that hoarding, we often have that connection, that genetic connection. It often runs in family to some extent. And the experience may be similar for folks who are, in the same family or same environment, so to speak. There's lots of information with regards to some of those predispositions that result in people engaging in hoarding behavior. Their behavior triggers as well. Oftentimes, the research has shown that adolescence and early adulthood is where we see a lot of the hoarding disorder manifesting. So a lot of the early presentation occurs in that age or that age range. And it accelerates through late adulthood as people unfold. Those behaviors become more and more impairing and distressful or distressing. There are common co-occurrences as well. Folks who also present with clinically viable hoarding disorders are also oftentimes presenting with OCD or depression or ADHD. So there's lots of co-occurring elements there, comorbid conditions that also run side by side with hoarding disorder. And that's important to note, that They may accompany hoarding disorder, but hoarding disorder may be present and prevalent in its own right. So is that common? Are those some of the commonalities that you may see, or things that you see presenting with folks who may be experiencing some of hoarding concerns? And what we've also found is a lot of folks who are often diagnosed with hoarding disorder or experiencing clinically relevant hoarding conditions may have inherent impairment or characteristics, like negative personality traits that really include having a prominent sense of avoidance and anxiety and indecision and perfectionism or poor social skills. So some of those show up as well as characteristics in people who often experience hoarding disorder. And as we can certainly make the connection, avoidance and anxiety can certainly further trigger those hoarding behaviors. To actually avoid distress or to sometimes try to soothe those distress. So this is basically just background information as to what it looks like, what are some of the characteristics and the similarities of folks who may present with hoarding. And Phoebe says, I have definitely seen hoarding run in families, intergeneration, in different households. Absolutely, it's very common. And we're still trying to get a better sense as to whether or not that's inherent in that sense, or is it more conditioning by behavior, by what we see people. The tendency of if we see people coping in this way in our family, we tend to use the coping mechanism that is practiced most popularly or folks are more familiar with. So there's lots of ways that presents and what may be the causative element of it. So I want to look at the situation, look at a specific example here of someone living with clutter and hoarding behaviors, and to really gauge from our understanding of the clinical definition from the DSM-5 and our understanding about some of the background information as to whether or not we see how we would measure this person's behavior and how would we define it. So we want to look at Helen. And Helen is a 55-year-old woman who describes herself of having always been a pack rat. She tends to save things just in case she'll need them later, and she's always tended to let things pile up in her home. Now she has difficulty throwing away almost anything. And when junk mail comes into her home, she doesn't throw them away because she's afraid they might be imported. She keeps meaning to open the envelopes and find out what's inside, but more the pile has grown, the more overwhelmed she feels. And now she looks at the clutter, she feels extremely sad and fatigued and doesn't feel up to dealing with it. The question is, from that description, would you consider Helen's behavior to be that of a clinical hoarding situation, and what kind of severity of hoarding would you consider that to be? And you can look at it in terms of the severity, and we'll talk some more about that later on. In terms of, is that a mild case of hoarding? Is that a moderate case of hoarding? Is that an extreme case of hoarding? How would you describe Helen's concerns? Beverly says mild. Carrie says not hoarding in my opinion. And Alicia says it's distressing her, mild case. Great responses. Lisa says, I think it would be mild. Q says it's hard to know without being able to see. Interesting. To see the living environment, right? It sounds like hoarding, says Hannah, because she's distressed about throwing things away and is overwhelmed by her belongings. So it's a little speculative in a sense because we don't know Helen fully. We're just kind of getting that information. So is Helen's behavior a problem? That's the first place we have to start. And I think to some extent, it's very clear that her behavior is a problem for her. And Brittany says loss of grief could be part of this. So there's lots of, information that we need to gather before we're able to fully assess this properly. But a quick assessment of this or a quick, look at it, you may have to ask for some more information, right? You want to get some more information. She has a recent loss? Is this related to, a change, a traumatic instance in her life? You want to get some good background information. And Lisa says, if it's primarily just mild and mild, would see the environment. And Q says, I feel like we need to see how many piles, how big are the piles. And there's lots of ways of going about it, but the focus we have to have is, if Helen perceives it as a problem, she is overwhelmed by that perception of a problem, and it's impairing some functioning, is what is important to discern. And once we have a sense that there is no other condition that is circumstance that is contributing to it, and this is just, standing in its own in a sense, it's important to note. But in this case, it's problematic. There is some level of impairment here, and we can perceive this to be more of a mild case. So I think a lot of you are spot on. Harriet is, what if she doesn't see it as a problem? The important thing is making that assessment is not only gathering that person's perception of it, but looking at it objectively from its impairing quality or its distress-related element. So that's what's important to know. It's a good exercise, just kind of to jar your brain, to kind of have you use a filter and a process of really assessing and observing a circumstance and really looking at it from that perspective. So it's important to note, is there a challenge with discarding or collecting stuff to the extent that that person has difficulty making that decision? And is it impairing the person's general functioning, and is there related distress? It's important to know. So I'm hoping that that was a good example. It's a kind of quick one so that you can get a good feel for it and be able to make some decisions. And I think that was great work. What's important to note is that oftentimes, even when we look at hoarding from the perspective of clutter and collection from folks, it's important to note that animal hoarding is very common and is often overlooked. It's not often related in a general assessment. But animal hoarding is just as common as the collection of stuff, items, and stuff. And we see this often as a correlation where oftentimes when people are hoarding possessions, oftentimes animal hoarding is also concomitant. So what is animal hoarding? It's really a poorly understood phenomenon, but it really transcends just someone simply trying to own a lot of animals or caring for more than the typical number of pets. Animal hoarding is beyond that. Over 250,000 animals are victims of hoarding annually. It's a large number. And there are two types of presenting animal hoarding conditions. Those who are overwhelmed caregivers, are people who started out by collecting, a number of animals and then reach a point where it's so overwhelming. They have so many animals that they can't care for them in a way that is deemed reasonable care. And they're rescue hoarders. People who often believe that they're the only people who can care for those animals, and the numbers get to the point where they've lost track of the element. It is really an accumulation of animals that has overwhelmed the person's ability to provide minimum standards of care. And these standards include nutrition, sanitation, shelter, veterinary care, and socialization. It's really, animal hoarding is really defined as having more than the typical number of animals, failing to provide minimal standards of care, and denial of the inability to provide this minimum care and the impact of the failure it has on the dwellings of these animals and the household. So it's really about that person denying that they're unable or they have the inability to care for animals to the minimum level, and they have no sense of the failure and how that failure to take care of those animals at the minimum standard is really impacting their household and the human occupants. And there's that persistence, despite this failure in doing so, in accumulating and controlling animals. So despite that, there's a consistent level of accumulation. What's important to note, it is the #1 cause of cruelty to animals. Hoarding presents as such, particularly facing companion animals. And it causes both suffering to the animals and the humans that are engaged in the process. And it's a community problem, because classically what happens subsequently, after it reached this point of this, excess and distress, it trickles out to everyone in the neighborhood, right? You have rabid animals out there, you have animals that are unkept and not cared for. It just becomes a sanitary disaster, as well as really a terrible situation for the animals. So it's important to note, to look out, to keep an eye out for both circumstances when you are dealing with someone who may have a history of hoarding, that animal hoarding is just as prominent. So as folks in our role who support and help people through the process of addressing, first of all, acknowledging or being aware of the condition and then attempting to address it, it's important for us to know the perspectives, particularly when someone is in the throes of hoarding and really, as Lisa said earlier, maybe in denial. The reality is, consumers with excessive clutter are less likely to figure out or identify clear goals or participate in services, because oftentimes there may be shame, there may be concerns about how you perceive, how they're perceived, or people may simply be not ready to deal with the problem. It may seem so overwhelmed that they don't think they can address it and find resolution. They're less likely to see clutter as a problem or has impact on others. Oftentimes when you're dealing with someone who's in that state, they may have no awareness or limited awareness as to the impact of the cluttering and the hoarding behaviors on themselves and others, even others in their household. Oftentimes what people who are striving to support and help them report, we often get providers who are irritated by the consumer's behavior and get confrontational or give negative appraisal. That people go in there and says, that person is just lazy, unhealthy, and selfish. They want to have 15 cats. They're just selfish. And there's often significant challenge assessing insight or readiness for change. How do you help that person fully appreciate and understand the extent of their challenge and problem, the extent of the challenge it presents to the animal or the people who are living in that condition, or the risk factors that are associated with their excessive cluttering connection? And Q says, animal hoarders with an ESA or service animal may also be afraid to seek service for fear their working animals will be taken. That often happens. The person may hoard a tremendous amount of animals, but they have 1 or 2 that they may be using for emotional support animal, and there may be fear that if you see that animal or come into their homes, you may actually discard it or call the authorities on them. So there's lots of fears and anxiety build up. And oftentimes people get more and more isolated or withdrawn from the social engagement. So there's often resistance to attempts at interventions. People can, suddenly stop making appointments or start canceling appointments or telling you to meet them somewhere else or not meeting up when you schedule. As the problem gets more and more, people get more and more isolated and removed and have greater challenge with really engaging with providers. What we also find is great avoidance and rejection from people who are trying to help. And oftentimes staff report high burnout rates trying to support and help someone with hoarding, because it's a very challenging undertaking. And particularly what we find is that people are not always in a state of readiness that will really propel them towards change behavior. And Serenity says, definitely experience people canceling in-home appointments, and that's common. And we'll talk more about some skills and approaches to how to navigate that challenge. So I wanted to give you a break, but we started a little late. So if you don't mind, I want to kind of keep moving along. All in favor of moving through it? All right. And I saw someone had a hand up. Harriet, go right ahead, Harriet.
Okay, so I have a, can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I have a question. And if an individual buys things to sell
Mhm.
and then isn't able to sell all of the items, and it becomes or a situation where they have so much stuff that they're not able to sell, and they don't want to throw it away, or they don't want to get rid of it because it has value to them, because they don't want to keep it, but they want to sell it.
Okay.
Is that considered something that would be a hoarding disorder?
It's a very good question, Harriet, and appreciate you asking that question. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pose it to the audience. I'm going to have someone give me some feedback if they're willing to jump in. Based on what we just saw in terms of the criteria for hoarding as a disorder, what are some thoughts about what Harriet just shared? Go ahead, Q.
Yeah, so I was just thinking, it would probably depend a lot on the actual value of the item, because I can imagine that if you are of low income and you're struggling to make rent and you have one item that is worth money to you, I can understand needing or even having anxiety about not selling it because you need that money, you need to sell it. But if it's actually an item that doesn't have value to other people, that's probably not going to sell for a considerable amount of money, then I think in that case, it sounds a lot more like a stalling tactic to me. And that could more make me lean towards a possible hoarding diagnosis or hoarding behavior, if not diagnosis.
Interesting. We talk about the value. That's an interesting perspective. I think when we talk about disorder, we're talking about impairment in that person's, some aspect of that, some dimension of that person's life as a result of the collection or failure to discard stuff. So it's important to note that when we're talking about whether or not a behavior is a disorder, we're talking about, is that behavior creating significant impairment in that person's functioning to the extent that that person cannot function in the way that they ought to, or they're willing to and desire to, and the behavior that they're engaging in is so distressing that they're unable to actually move beyond that behavior. So that's important to know. So one of the things that I always say to folks is that we're not in the business of diagnosing people, but we're in the business of fully understanding clearly whether or not the behavior of collecting stuff or failure to discard stuff has become so distressing and impairing to that person's functioning that that person requires some level of intervention to either get back to or to meet that level of functioning that they desire. Does that help to answer the question, Harriet?
Yes. So my question is he doesn't feel as distressed as, let's say, someone in his family.
Okay.
So, and I'll be honest with you, my husband has this problem, and so this is one of the reasons I'm doing it. It's he'll buy things to want to sell them.
Yes.
And there is so much stuff now that he is unable to sell it all. And there's no outlet for him. I mean, he's doing consigning, he's doing lots of different things, but there has become so much. It's stressing for me.
I think you hit it on the head. And thank you so much for sharing with us. I know how challenging it can be to share about a loved one. I'm glad that you took the step to be here, to learn the skills to support that person, have that person. That's remarkable on your part. And we want to congratulate you for taking that step. It's important. What's important to note is And we talked about that a little earlier. Even if that person is not aware of the impact it has on the people in the household, if it's distressful and impairing to people in the household, and that person is not conscious or not responsive to that, that's a challenge, that's a problem, right? That's disordered functioning. So that's where it's important to note, even if that person may not be fully aware of the impact on it, if the collection of stuff is causing distress to the level where other people can't function in that household, it's a problem and it needs intervention. It needs to be addressed because that person's continuing in that behavior is not going to help the situation. The situation is not going to resolve on its own. And we congratulate you, Harriet, for being brave and being here with us. And we hope that we can really help and support you through this process. And keep sharing. This is phenomenal. So what's the foundation of excessive clutter? Because I have to be as forthright as I can with you in the sense that we live in a society where collecting stuff and owning stuff and having stuff is oftentimes cheered and looked upon as status bearing and sometimes even a sense of accomplishment. So we have to be very careful, right? Someone with 35 handbags that are using those handbags cannot automatically be deemed as a hoarder unless it's causing impairment and distress to that person. So we have to really look at it concretely and objectively. So there's a modern balance of buying and throwing out stuff. In our society, we constantly do that because you'll be surprised, and I'll say this, and you may not be surprised. Other societies may look at us as Americans, the way we live, just the fact that we have so much stuff. It's easy for someone outside who doesn't understand how it impacts us, may see us as generates a society of hoarders because we collect so much stuff, right? But if it's functional and purposeful for us, it's not necessarily a disorder in that sense. So someone from the outside looking in without fully understanding the impact your behavior have on you can deem it different things. But we live in a society where, in today's society in particular, buying and throwing away stuff is a norm. And it's resulting because there's lots of cheap and disposable stuff being sold and gathered and collected. There's an increase in buying and acquiring in our society, an increase in throwing out and discarding stuff, right? I always think of it. One of the largest vessels in my home is a garbage can and a recycle can. There's probably some of the biggest vessels in most of our homes, right? They're large because there's an expectation that we collect and dispose of a lot of stuff on a daily basis. It's frightening sometimes when you drive by some homes and you see all the garbage and recycling cans outside and they're towering. You know, it's like the more luxurious an area you go into, the larger the recycle cans and the garbage cans. Don't you notice that? Tell me if you've noticed that. That the more affluent the area, it seems like the larger the disposal units are. Has that been your experience? Because it's been mine. Q says he definitely knows. I've noticed that just as I got into this stuff. I'm like, let me take a look at that. Why is it? And they're neat. Some of them are just fancy color, and we take so much pride in our disposal and collection of stuff. It's remarkable. And Harriet says we rent an actual garbage container. Look at that. So there's a societal element to it, right? A normalizing stuff. So we have to be very careful with how we view it. And there's people out of balance by social standards, right? It's hard to stop or resist acquiring. And it's hard to get rid of stuff for a lot of folks. I think in the last cohort I shared with people, one day I got up and realized I had more than 50 shoes. And I was wondering, how the hell did that happen? How did I end up with 50 pairs of shoes? And guess what? What I realized is that's the only ones that I counted. Don't mean that's all of them. But I to this day, I have shoes that, lucky for me, my foot size hasn't grown significantly, but I have shoes I know I haven't worn in more than 2 years. And I realized, what am I doing? That's not okay. Why am I accumulating new ones. So I've gotten into this habit. If I buy one, I have to get rid of two. So there's a balance. So I've learned my own interventions to help me stay on track. But it's important to note how societally, how just a normal functioning can result in a lot of accumulation and discarding. And you have to ask yourself, as I did, do I have an imbalance between discarding and consuming? Am I collecting more than I'm getting rid of? Is there a balance? It's important to look at that from your own perspective. And John says our shelter will always accept donations of shoes. All right, John, I'm gonna put you on speed dial. I have to keep that in mind. I did over the holidays. I did my prideful stuff, and I sent it off to Goodwill, and I felt so good about myself. You know, because I'm a Clark's guy, so I always see my shoes as having all these connections to all these things. You know, my dad and my grandfather and my heritage and all that stuff. And I'm like, Earl, stop making excuses. It's just shoes. Michelle says, it's 57 pairs of shoes too many. Michelle, I'm not going to give an opinion, but I'm just going to say you got 7 more than I. So we've got work to do. That's all right. Once it's not distressing and impairing to your function, once the shoes are not clogging up your egress and exit of your home, it's a workable problem. So why do people save all that stuff? There's evidence to support that oftentimes it's that concept of aesthetic, that sense of beauty. You know, you buy some things because there's that sense that this stuff is so unique. I could never find another one like it, right? I can tell you that for a fact. I have this pair of Clarks, a split stem. They made it in the 70s. They're no longer making it. They stopped making it, and I'm holding on to it like it's some treasure. Knowing fully well, I don't know when I'm going to wear gum bottom shoes, but I'm holding on to it. Maybe I'll pass it on. But that happens oftentimes to people, is that concept of this is such a beautiful, unique, singular item, I need to hold on to it. And Lisa says, thank you for all making me feel better about my 30 pairs. Okay, Lisa, stick around. Hopefully you don't move beyond 30 pairs of shoes. Also, there's the concept of intrinsic value, the usefulness of an item, right? I might need this later and I can't afford to get another one. You know, how many of us have 4 or 5 shovels in our shed or garden that we haven't used? But we're walking by Home Depot and we're looking at the same shovel saying, this one looks a little easier to use. And you got 4 in your garden. Just the concept of collecting stuff sometimes. So you have to think of it from that perspective. Or there may be a sentimental value to it, right? Whether it's an old toy, a teddy bear from your childhood, something that has that. Books. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think of it, you have books, particularly textbooks from 30 years, and you know darn well you can't reference a 30-year-old textbook because nobody's going to see that as current. But you're holding on to that first edition of Abnormal Behavior. You remember the book from like 1979 or something? You're holding on to it because it's like, when I read this, it connected with my first step into college. So you start having a lot of sentimental connections with stuff. If I give it away, I will lose this memory forever. It's like giving away a part of myself. Why we're looking at the reason why people say it is because when these reasons are used to the extent that it becomes so much out of order. Because remember, no one starts hoarding by simply saying, I'm going to get up today and I'm going to start hoarding. Never starts that way, right? It starts with good intentions, some kind of path that is based on some rational, tangible thought and practice, and then it gets out of control. So it's good to know where it comes from. When someone says, well, I bought this because it was beautiful. It was the only vase or vase that I ever really liked. My mom had one like this. My grandmother had one like this. And I always felt that I should own one like it. And then you said, so how many of those you own? Well, I've gotten one for my grandmother, and this is the 15th. It's like, okay, when have you used those vases? I haven't used this one. I'm afraid to use it because it may break. So why are you holding on to it as a vase, but you're not ever thinking of using it? So those are some of the elements when things get really out of control in terms of starting from a good place and getting out of sorts. So it's important to note, and says, I want to make sure that I'm following. Q says, I'm just going to say this definitely intersects with immigration in a powerful way. There's nothing a human on earth could do to make my grandmother part of the vase she brought with her when she escaped the Angolan War. Absolutely. No doubt about it. And we find that often when people are displaced or move and they bring things with them that has that sentimental value to it, it's hard to, you know, get rid of it or discard it, even if its usefulness has been lost. People still have that attachment to it. It's when that becomes so distressing that the thought of even using it or the thought of losing it is a distress in itself, then that's a problem. So different relationship to important stuff. It's important to note, what are the reasons people buy things? Oftentimes to use for financial value, you know, when you buy something that you think you're going to resell, as Harriet talked about, for status. We think of, you know, and I'll just put this out there and you can shoot me when you're done with your words. People who buy, the, you know, the expensive red bottom shoes that the ladies buy, and I'm like, is anyone going to see the bottom of that shoes unless you are wearing it? You can't wear it upside down, right? But it has value. It has a status associated with it, right? A burger bag, or a particular kind of sneakers or tennis shoes. You know, you're wearing the Jumpman Michael Jordan's $250 sneakers because you think it attached. There's a status attached to it. So there's those elements. And it's important to note why we purchase things, right? For memory or for sentiment. Harriet, okay. So that's important to note why we buy things. Because like I said, and Chris says, buying now, saving for retirement. That's another good element. Because I'm going to buy this, its value is going to increase exponentially. By the time I retire, it's going to be worth whatever. So there's no bad reason for starting. It's where it ends up is the problem, right? And reasons for throwing things away. Obsolescence, it's no longer needed. Single use, it's disposable. You know, I think of, do you know the person who holds on to disposable shaving blades and have a collection of them? And it clearly states on the package, disposable, single use. But the person has 100 of them that has all been used. We discard it because it has no function, right? The old sewing machine or the old stuff that is no longer functioning, we discard it. No longer needed. You move to a different place, it may no longer has utility. Or deterioration, its construct has faltered, you know, it's no longer functioning the way it should. Reasons for discarding it. I know. Q says you think of those dumb kitchen gadgets on Amazon at 11 p.m. and think, oh, this could solve problems. Yes, I've seen so many different instruments for cutting a vegetable. I forgot that the knife is even the most simplest way. There's a million ways of cutting. I was like, what happened to a knife? It's right in my kitchen. Why would I go buy 4 other elements, 4 other instruments that can do the same job a knife does? So think of a common reason that you discard stuff, because these are the ones that we know of. What is the reason for you discarding stuff? Why do you get rid of stuff? I know for me, sometimes it's redundance. You know, I have 2 of the same or 3 of the same. I don't need that. It's time to get rid of one and make use of the one that I have. But are there times when there are reasons to throw something away, but you don't? Have you experienced that where there's a good reason to throw away something, but you don't throw it away because you have an attachment to it of some sort? Not enough space to keep. Beverly says, I feel like when my house is cluttered, my space is not clean, it's hard to get the rest of my life organized. Yes, it can be precedent setting. Clutter tends to lend itself to clutter, tends to lend itself to really tumultuous thinking or processing. It can impact your state of mind and your state of affairs. So I'm going to move beyond this because I don't want, we don't have the time for you to get into a practice, but it really would ask you to take a conscientious look at what important stuff you bought or acquired in the last week, right? And why did you acquire it? Did you think about it, or you barely think about acquiring it? And share with me, if you can, in the chat, something you bought within the last week or acquired. And how did you purchase it? Did you think about it? Did you have a long process, or did you just buy it impulsively? And Hannah says, I keep things that are still perfectly good, but I don't use them. Like art supplies are something I use very infrequently, but I'm afraid I'll regret throwing them away if I want them later. Great example, Hannah. Lots of folks have that dilemma. The question is always the same. If you've had it so long and you haven't used it, you have to ask yourself, when you're ready to use it or use something of that sort, is that stuff going to be available, or is it going to be available for you to purchase it when you're ready? Because if you hold on to 10 of them, it's going to be challenging because you really need only one of that stuff to function when you need it. And Sarah says, I do the same thing with art supplies. Now I tell myself, I don't need to buy anymore. Or you need to use it. And if you don't use it, then you need to figure out that when you're ready to get into art, you can always acquire it, right? You don't need to hold on to it for the sense that at some point it's going to be useful. Because when you're ready, there's always going to be that opportunity there. Nothing today is to that degree where it's not produced again. Even if it's produced in a different dimension, a different shape, and a different form, there's always something similar or has the same function. And Michelle says, impulsively bought $100 worth of jewelry and gadgets on Amazon because I was bored. Thank you for sharing, Michelle. That is more common than you could imagine. What's the great thing about Amazon, though? When you buy something that you realize, I don't need that anymore. Or I shouldn't have. Or it doesn't have any utility. What's the great thing I love about Amazon? Come on. I know most of you probably shop at Amazon. What's the great thing about Amazon when you buy something that you know that you've realized that you don't need, you don't want, or you don't want to keep it? What do? You can return it. Easy return. So that's important to note. You don't have to hold on to it simply because you made an initial impulsive purchase, right? You can always change the course of action by making a change, intervening on your own behalf. Think of something you've gotten rid of over the last week. And why did you discard it? Absolutely. Q says, I can just put it back in the Amazon locker at my apartment. There you have it. Think of something you discarded. How did you make that decision? Did you think about it a lot, or did you barely think about just discarding it? Because the question I'm going to ask you then is, how would you describe your relationship to stuff? What is your relationship to important stuff? I think I mentioned earlier to you, particularly with the shoes, the relationship I had with the shoes, a particular brand of shoes, was a reflection of my connection with my father and my grandfather who wore Clark shoes, who prominently wore Clark shoes, loved the shoes, talk about from its design to everything else. What I realized after I bought about 10 pairs of Clarks is that I could relate to them without having to impact myself financially by purchasing shoes. One Clarks was just as connected to them as I could be as 10 would. I didn't need 10 to feel connected to them, right? And in many ways, there's a million other ways I can feel connected. I can pull out a photo album, right? Even though they're deceased, I have ways of connecting with the essence of who they are, and wearing a shoes is not the only representative way of doing that. And Hattie says it correctly. Hardest thing to throw out is items given to me by others. And as we dive more into interventions, we'll look at how valuable it can be to actually, as you get something from somebody that gave to you, even if it had value when it was given as a gift and over the years, a better way of also managing that circumstance is to gift it to someone else who may have the same way of appreciating it. So sometimes it's passing it along, right? Because in essence, very few people give you a gift with the expectation that you're going to keep it for the rest of your life. It's just not the way it operates. But we can think that. Doesn't make that thought process accurate. And Q says, I want to throw away a birthday card for my grandmother-in-law, but I remember how old she is and I might not be able to get another one of those this year, and I couldn't toss it. Great observation, Q. My question to you is this. How about taking a photo of that card and storing it in the cloud? Same element, you have all the information, right? Less space. One way of looking at it. You can still have the memory without having the physical element of it that clutters up your space. Thank God for smartphones today, right? And storage, you can store so much information. And share it, use it. If the memory sparks your interest and really promotes something in yourself, share it with somebody you love, right? Read a card to someone who can appreciate the sentiment your grandmother was making to you, and that, in essence, creates even more of a memory than a physical element. So there's ways of approaching that. Absolutely. I know people who have tassels from their gown, the caps from their high school, right? And it's in a box. And people are actually buying houses and space with extra rooms just to keep stuff. You have to start asking yourself, is the value in the stuff, or is the value in the actual connection and attachment you have to it as opposed to the thing itself? So we'll talk some more about people's perception and thinking about items, their relationship with items, and how it impacts ordered or disordered collection. So we'll look at that as we go along. But today's first meeting was really designed to give you an overview of hoarding, to really get you an understanding as to the sentiments and the emotional attachment that regards to hoarding, how hoarding starts oftentimes from a rational, practical place and can get out of order, and the fact that not only do we need to be sensitive and thoughtful and compassionate in our approach to supporting people, but we have to look within ourselves as well to see some of those same behaviors that for other people can become disordered and out of control, how those behaviors can be normative for us if we have ways of limiting and setting boundaries. Because you cannot help and support someone effectively with hoarding if you don't have a full understanding that that person may have started this behavior with a thoughtful, practical reason, and it just got out of hand and out of control, and now their lives are taken over by that stuff. They did not start out hoarding in a purposeful way. That was not the intent. So are there any questions from today's material? And I'm so delighted you were very engaged today. This is what this is supposed to be. We want to share. We want to make sure this is a collective learning. This is a sharing opportunity. This is a place where we're coming in and we're all seeing each other as experts in our own rights. And we want to make sure that the information that we share is thoughtful and respectful, as well as it's really purposeful and focused on the issue we're addressing. So what we're going to ask is for you to complete an evaluation. It's in the chat. Take a few quick seconds to just fill out that application, because it allows us to really discern how this particular learning community is impacting you, what we can do differently, what we're doing well, how this is meaningful to you, and how you can make the most of the information shared here. So while you take a moment to complete that evaluation, I'm also going to share with you the learning application. And we started out early by saying that to you, that the most essential aspect of this is not just understanding the machination of hoarding disorder and the knowledge, skills, and resources related to supporting someone, but really taking those skills and putting them into practice and bringing back feedback for us to get a sense as to how things went when you tried putting those skills into practice. So the learning application for this particular meeting is for you to try to get a copy of Buried in Treasure. So the hope is that whether your organization purchases it, we can do that for yourself, but it's a great text that you can use to really develop your own skills and follow along in the training, because it goes through all the chapters, it goes through the entire text, and it's really a good guide. And like I said, it can be used by both people in the professional role, people who are supporting their loved ones, and people who are actually supporting folks who are supporting folks with hoarding disorder. So there's a worksheet, and that worksheet, we are going to give you that information that you can use. I want you to pay attention and write down the important items acquired and discarded and the associated feelings that come with those purchases or those discarding of those items. So that's going to be important for us to share. And Crystal shared the worksheet in the chat, so you can click on that worksheet and it's going to take you to that worksheet, or you can copy it or you can print it so you can practice within the next few weeks. And ultimately, we want you to know that we have this monthly meeting. The next meeting is going to be March 28th, and I'm going to correct that time. It's from 10 to 11:30. So make sure that that's correct. We're going to start at 10 and go into 11:30. And you're already registered. You're using the same link. So please make sure that that's you keep that link, and that's the same link you're going to use monthly for the meetings. I want to thank you. We appreciate your time and attention and participation. And today's webinar was hosted by DBHR through the Washington Healthcare Authority. I'd like to remind you that the slides and the link to the recording of this session will be shared with you. Don't forget to check out our Foundational Community Supports newsletter on all things FCS, and upcoming trainings are also available on our website. Here's the information for FCS providers in the Mirror Group. And thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you next month and ongoingly as we walk our way through Buried in Treasures, the learning community. It was definitely a great opportunity and experience to spend time with you. Learned so much today. Look forward to sharing that with you. So if you have questions, I'm going to be here for a minute or two, but if not, I want to bid you farewell and look forward to seeing you next month. Do enjoy the rest of your day. Absolutely, Peggy. Take care.